Today's episode is sponsored by my friends at Flint Custom Hats. Every single Flint hat is made one at a time inside their shop right here in Lubbock, Texas. I've been wearing Flint hats for many years now, and I can say they are beautiful, long-lasting, perfect-fitting hats, custom-made to your specifications. If you'd like a good quality, hand-built hat, I highly recommend you check them out at flinthat.com. I recently launched an account on Patreon.com. Patreon is a website that allows you to offer monthly support to creative works that you enjoy and admire. And in my case, in exchange for that support, you get access to some exclusive content. You can check that out if you'd like to help me keep the show going at patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. That's patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. The interview on today's episode was recorded right outside of Las Vegas, New Mexico in S. Omer Barker country. So I'd like to start today's show with a poem written by the great New Mexico poet S. Omer Barker. This piece is entitled Canned Tomatoes. Them old-time western cowboys mostly ate what they could get and drank what turned up handy. But I've heard them all admit they sometimes got so tired of beans, of beef, and even taters, they'd pert near swap their saddles for a bait of canned tomatoes. About the only stuff in cans them days was pork and beans, tomatoes, eagle milk and corn, and maybe some sardines, and none of these was plentiful out where the cow trails ran, for grub come mighty costly when you bought it in the can. But sometimes in the wagon bed of big ranch operators you'd find maybe a case or two of stuff called canned tomatoes. Them old-time cowhands never heard of vitamins and such. They never craved no fancy foods, at least not very much. But coming in from cow work where the dust was thick and hot, them juicy, cool tomatoes, well, they sure did hit the spot. You even liked 'em better than you did dried apple pie, and when your outfit furnished 'em, you sure was living high. Why, even when you et in town, you shocked them restaurant waiters by turning fancy victuals down and eating canned tomatoes. A batchin' in the boar's nest, as the line camps then was called, you often tired of cooking and your appetite got stalled, but if there upon the shelf some canned tomatoes stood, you'd cut a can for supper and it sure did savor good. Some days inside your slicker you would pack a can or two tied on behind your saddle. And if the water holes was few, you'd cut a can and drink it as you jogged along the road, and swear that canned tomatoes was the best fruit ever growed. In town, the morning after you'd helped the hoot-owl hoot, your tongue would taste like leather from the top of some old boot, until you found a grocer who would trust you for a can, and when you'd cut and drunk it, you was sure a different man. That's how them oldsters tell it of the days when life was rough, when riding men was rawhide men and nothing else but tough, when men with hides and stomachs like an old bull alligator's was still like kids for candy when it come to canned tomatoes. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy west and beyond. My guest today is Gary Morton. Gary Morton is a working cowboy and an artist. He started working on the historic Bell Ranch in 1969 when he was 18 years old, and eventually worked his way up to becoming the wagon boss on the Bell Ranch. Gary is one of the founding directors of the Working Ranch Cowboys Association, which presents the World Championship Ranch Rodeo every November in Amarillo, Texas. In 2015, Gary was awarded the Rounders Award from the New Mexico Department of Agriculture. In talking about his art, Gary says, "I don't just paint for myself, but to honor the working cowboy." I sat down with Gary in his home studio just outside of Las Vegas, New Mexico, and recorded this interview. Here's Gary Morton.
Well, I was born in Tucumcari and raised there. My dad was in the farm machinery business, and he also did some custom farming. So, it was pretty much agriculture and outdoors and all that, and he took me to work with him and made me learn how to mechanic. And he used to take me on some of his custom farming deals, and he used to cut hay out at Conchas Dam. And even when I was a little kid, we'd go down the road that led to the Bell Ranch. And at that time, it's different now, but at that time there was a big locked gate. And you could just see that road going over hill after hill after hill into nowhere. And so we'd go to that gate, and then we'd turn and go down the fence. And there was a big farm down there. And he worked down there. And every time we went to that gate, well, I wondered, what's over there? Well, and I was a little old kid, but I grew up, and of course, Tucumcari is the closest town to the Bell Ranch. And so when I got to be a teenager, and pretty mischievous teenager, the Bell Cowboys, the single guys, would come to town on weekends or at the end of the month mostly. About once a month they'd show up. And man, all of us guys thought they were just the coolest thing you ever saw. And they worked for the Bell Ranch. Of course, the Bell Ranch is a big deal, still is today. It's a big old place, and a lot of history there and all that. Well, the Bell Ranch, of course, it was an old Mexican land grant. It was the Pablo Montoya land grant. And it was nearly 700,000 acres. They sold off a few portions over the years. They sold a part of it in 1912, but in 1947, they split it up into several ranches and sold it. All of it is still ranch country, and it's a good ranch. In that part of the world, of course, it has to rain and it can get dry, but it's really a pretty good ranch, and it has a fair amount of live water on it, kind of, and the Canadian River runs right through it, and it borders Conchas Lake. The reason it's called the Bell Ranch, there's a mesa on there that is shaped like a bell. It's Bell Mountain. So that's where the ranch got its name and its brand. They also brand a bell. It's had relatively few owners in the course of its history. I mean, it's like 5 or 6 in, over 100 years. And anyway, I went to work there. Well, I'll tell you the rest of how I got into cowboying. Of course, raised in a place like that, you're kind of exposed to livestock and all of that. And we thought, when we was kids, we thought we were cowboys, but we weren't. I actually got kicked out of school in my senior year in Tucumcari, and I had an aunt and uncle that lived in Gallup, and I went to Gallup and lived with them in order to graduate. But they were big into rodeo, and they had kids younger than me that all rodeoed, and the dad was a team roper. And I got really interested in it. The first time I went and watched those kids compete in a rodeo, I saw something there that I knew I didn't have. And those kids were so dedicated, so thrilled to be doing it, and, giving their 100%. And it really struck me, and I thought, man, there's something about this that these kids are excited about. And I said, I think I could get excited about it too. So I began to talk to my uncle and told him I wanted to try it. Wanted to try bareback horses. And he gave me one of those spring things you squeeze. And he says, you work on this for a few months. He said, then we'll get you on a horse. And I did. I was pretty dedicated to it. And Sure enough, I got on a few bareback horses. And I'm sure he probably knew the stock contractor and got me an easy one. And I thought, oh, that first one I rode him, and I thought, man, this is going to be my career. Well, it didn't take me very long to starve out. So I went back to Tucumcari that summer and needed a job. And so I just called up the Bell Ranch. I have no idea. I thought, that's the place. And the manager happened to be in town. I met him at the Pontiac dealership. He interviewed me. Asked me if I'd ever rode any broncs. I said, you bet. That's what I've been doing all summer. Well, I didn't know the difference between a rodeo bronc and a ranch bronc, which is just a young horse, you know. And he hired me, and I went to work. I didn't even have a car. I'd blown up my car. Got a friend to drive me to the Bell Ranch, and of course all my buddies in town there said, oh boy, them Bell Ranch guys will kick your butt and send you home within a week, giving me a hard time. And anyway, this buddy drove me to that same locked gate, and they had a guy meet me there, and he was an old Latino guy, and he looked like he was 80, but he was probably 50. Just an old, mean, tough-looking old guy. And I had borrowed a saddle from my granddad, throwed it in the back of that pickup, and waved goodbye to my friend and went to headquarters. And they put me in the bunkhouse and went to work the next day. Well, those first few years, really the first year was just pretty hard. I really didn't have a clue what I was doing. And of course, all I had was broncs. There were some other guys there, and remained friends with them, all of them, that were young single guys. They were working there for the summer during their college break. They were good to me. They got me out of many jackpots. They spent a lot of time catching my horses after they bucked me off and all of that. And so at the end of the summer, they all left and went back to college. So that left me there in the bunkhouse alone. I continued to work and they pulled a wagon then. It wasn't a horse-drawn wagon. It was a big deuce-and-a-half army truck with a kitchen built on the back. But it was pretty serious the way they worked. They'd pull out about the 1st of October and worked pretty much the whole month of October. And they had not a lot of full-time hands, and most of the hands that they would hire for the spring or the fall works were day workers. And many of them were from up here around Las Vegas. And of course they were all cowboys, and oh man, they give me a hard time. They'd throw a hat under my horse or something, anything to see me bucked off, and I got to where I could kind of ride one, and then they'd ride up beside me and start slapping my hand with a quirt or something to make me turn loose of the saddle horn. And I thought I was the most persecuted fella on earth. I finally just got mad enough one day. I backed up in a corner. I said, okay, you son of a guns, come on, one at a time or all at once, I don't care. And they just looked at each other and they laughed. And from that point forward, we were best friends. So, what I thought was my persecution was actually my cowboy schooling. And it was probably done in a manner that many were done that way. The wagon boss at the time was a guy named Leo Turner. And there's still people around that knew him. Of course, he's been dead a long time, but probably the finest man I ever met. Never saw him lose his temper but once, maybe. And he had a constant parade of kids through that place and made men out of them and treated them well. And nobody that ever worked for Leo disliked him. He was a fine human being. And so I stayed, ultimately got married there in 1970. Well, they didn't have a place for a married man. So I left there, did a short stint at the Missouri beef packers at Friona, Texas, working in that slaughterhouse. And, I guess I did all right at it, but when a ranch job come up, I got a ranch job on the border in Arizona, not too far from Nogales. I went to Arizona and stayed there about 9 months. It's just too hot. Boy, we'd saddle a horse at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and go work till maybe noon if it wasn't too hot. And it was what they call a greasy sack outfit. We'd pack a lunch, sandwich. And about noon, we'd quit and crawl up under a mesquite bush or something and eat our lunch and take a nap and probably wouldn't go back to work till 4 or 5 o'clock. And then we'd work till dark. And this guy I worked for, he liked to rope. So then he would, when we got home after that, he'd want to rope all night. And the guy that had been there before me was trying to be a saddle bronc rider. So that boss liked him, I guess, and he would go to Tucson and buy any horse that was listed in the classified ads in the newspaper and bring them out there and let this guy try to make them buck. And that was my string. And so for a long time, all I could do is watch them rope. Them horses didn't go for that. But I finally got them to roping a little bit and would rope with them. But anyway, I was just there about 9 months, and then the Bell Ranch called, and they had doubled the size of the ranch. At the time when I first went to work there, it was only 130,000 acres, and it was basically the headquarters unit of the old original Bell. But a guy, in fact, I was working there when he bought it in 1970, Bill Lane, he was a guy out of Chicago, bought it, and within a year he bought another ranch which had also been part of the old original land grant, and it was Wagner's, the same Wagner's out of Texas. But this, WT is the Texas Wagner. This was I believe it was WT's son, but he was kind of the black sheep or something. Anyway, he came to New Mexico and bought that piece, and his name was Guy Wagner. He's the one that built this big old hacienda out there and all that. But Bill Lane had bought it, and it was about it must have been 140 or 50,000 acres. And ultimately, Bill Lane made 3 or 4 purchases that put that ranch at 292,000 acres. Anyway, they called me in Arizona. And of course, I left there on good terms. I left there to get married, and they didn't have a place for a married man. So anyway, they called me and asked me to come back, and it didn't take me long to get back. So I'll always feel like the Bell Ranch is where I grew up. It'll always be home to me.
In a song about the Bell Ranch entitled "The Boys on the Bell," singer-songwriter Luke Reed wrote these words. Don Pablo Montoya first found the place where we used to sit and let our ponies graze and wait for the sound 1,000 hooves make when we were just boys on the bell. Those bachelor cowboys were uncles to us, taught us all how to rope, wrestle, ride broncs, and cuss. But you learn not to frown or make any fuss. Back with the boys on the bell.
I guess I had been there about 7 years. Leo Turner was the wagon boss most of that time. He retired. He actually took a camp job and kind of stepped back from the wagon bossing deal. And they put another guy in there, and he lasted about a year. And I had a camp job. It was right outside Mescalero. I loved it. It was the rough country on the ranch, all the canyons and rim rocks and all that. But then they asked me to be wagon boss, so that from that point I moved back to headquarters. And about 2 years, and I got mad one day and quit. And that's when I started this art stuff. I didn't really want to go to the bottom and start over again, trying to climb up the ladder. And I looked for a managing job for about 6 or 8 months. And in the meantime, I kind of, not very well, but kind of supported the family with art. And finally one day I said, shoot, this deal's kind of working. I might as well try it. I got a job that was a half-time job, and it was taking care of a bunch of yearlings near Logan, New Mexico. And so I could work 2 weeks a month. They gave me a house to live in and a half a month's paycheck. And then I could paint the rest of the time. And that was really where I made the transition. But the bad thing about those yearling deals is it was strictly a yearling deal. In the fall, you ship those cattle and they don't need you anymore. So when that deal was over, that's when I decided I was going to be a full-time artist. And actually moved to the Hondo Valley down east of Ruidoso. And lived down in that country for about 17 or 18 years and kind of built the art deal up. Well, a campman, especially the big ranches, have certain sections of country that are called camps. For example, right now, the Bell has many camps on it, and each one is about 30,000 acres. Some of them are one-man camps, so you and your family are the only ones there. In fact, the last camp I had at the Bell, it was a single-man deal, and I was the only one there. But you have about 30,000 acres, and whatever cattle are on there are your responsibility year-round. Now, when you have to do something, work a herd or the spring works, branding, or fall works, weaning and shipping, the entire crew will work that country. So it's not like, most of the year you're there by yourself taking care of things. Like say there are some 2-man camps, and those 2 guys take care of things. And it's everything. It's everything from windmills to fences to the cattle themselves. A lot of cowboys prefer those kind of jobs because it's away from headquarters and away from the boss. You get to be your own boss, more or less. And by and large, a good boss doesn't oversee you on a daily basis. You're there because you're trusted. You're there because they know you take care of things. And so it's a little better than being around headquarters and the bosses all the time. Of course, headquarters would have, more than likely the boss lives there, and probably 4 or 5 cowboys, which is the case at the Bell, that live right there at headquarters. But for example, when you brand or anything else, the entire crew gets together and works the ranch. The last time I was at the Bells, which was 2010 to 2012, we did something. We pulled out a horse-drawn wagon the first time in 54 years, I think. And we worked that ranch. We started at headquarters, and we worked that ranch and never loaded a horse in a trailer. We did it all horseback. That was pretty thrilling. And they still use wagon, the same horse-drawn wagon now, I think, in the spring maybe. So that's kind of a campman job. I have to say this, of course I was married, but those jobs are kind of hard on the ladies, the wives, because of course a cowboy's got something to do. He leaves the house every day and goes works. It takes a pretty special kind of lady to live out in the middle of nowhere and be basically by herself all day, every day. So kudos to them. The wagon boss job is basically the number 2 man. You've got your ranch manager, and they call it wagon boss because, going back to the old days, they called it that. But it's basically the foreman. And he's the one that more than likely deals with the cowboys and lines them out and whatnot. If you're making a drive or something, the wagon boss scatters the drive and all that. Now, the last time I was gone from the Bell for 30 years. The last time I was at the Bell, they had changed things a little. And they no longer called campman just a campman. They called them camp managers and changed up the responsibilities. And it was a good thing. It was done out of respect, I think, but the camp managers developed their own budgets. They proposed their own projects, water improvement projects, anything like that. And then when the crew comes to work their country during the Wagon, the camp manager is the boss. He's the one that scatters the riders and all those sort of things. And the manager himself would take a step back when they were in that man's country. So I thought that was a good thing. And Chris Wilson was the manager when I was there. And he was a brilliant guy, hardworking guy, and a good man. He brought some of those things with him from Texas, I think. So the wagon boss job, Leo Turner, of course, we kept all the books on the horses, but the ranch had mares and studs and all that, and so all the breeding and all that stuff was kept in a little notebook that the wagon boss took care of. And then when we started horses and started breaking colts and all that, he kept notes on those colts and how they behaved and if they had any problems, physical or otherwise. And he rode over to me. We were making a drive one morning, and I saw him coming from way off out John around there, coming to me after they'd named me wagon boss. And he rode up and he said, "Congratulations," he says, "I want to give you these." And it was 2 little spiral, like pocket notebooks with all the horse records in it. At some point later, the ranch wanted to try to register those horses with AQHA. They never had been registered. They took those books over there to Amarillo to talk to them about registering. And they looked at them at AQHA and they said, "Well, you probably got better records on your horses than we have on ours. But it's still going to cost you," and I forget what it was. It was like $200 a head to register them. And of course, they didn't do it. And that they've gradually changed that over the years, and now I think most of them aren't registered. Kind of an interesting thing. And well, when he handed me those notebooks, Leo Turner says, "Congratulations," he says, "you are now the pissing post between the boss and the cowboys." But that's kind of what it is in a lot of ways, because you get it from both ends.
It's now been over 50 years since Gary Morton first hired on at the Bell Ranch in 1969. In 2011, Gary hired on for another stint at the Bell Ranch. In an article that Gary wrote for Range magazine, he reflected on the changes he had seen on the Bell Ranch and said this: "The historic Bell Ranch that has been the setting for so many lives and countless memories endures much like it has forever. The tracks are now made by cattle instead of buffalo. Horses are now shod instead of going barefoot. The passage of time has changed its appearance, but its spirit remains the same."
Well, of course, somebody older than me will tell you we were a bunch of sissies. But when I went to work there was one little homemade 4-horse trailer on the ranch that we seldom used. In fact, the remuda at that time was about 120 head of horses, and most of them had not been in a trailer. There were still a few horses that we had to tie in the trailer to keep them from jumping out. And I've seen them jump out more than once, going down the road, and they just couldn't stand it. And of course, nowadays, everybody's got a trailer, and they trailer everything everywhere. And in fact, it's kind of amazing to me nowadays. Nearly every ranch has a cattle truck, and when it's handy and when it makes sense, they'll haul those cattle rather than drive them. But we drove them everywhere. The biggest truck I'd seen when I was a kid there was just like a 40-foot straight trailer. And now, shoot, they got, I don't even know how long they are, 50-footers and 2 decks and all that stuff. They can haul a lot of cattle in one trip. Of course, being a cowboy there, you become consumed with it. And that's where I really got exposed to Charlie Russell and Will James. Of course, there was no TV in the bunkhouse or anything, and started reading Will James books and things like that. And I don't know that happens much anymore. As I mentioned, I was gone from there 30 years, and I went back, and I really wondered how much things would have changed. And they have. But I think the underlying, in fact, I wrote an article for Range magazine about it. The underlying thing is that the spirit remains the same. Those guys, those young guys, they've all got college educations now. They know things, a lot of the technical things and a lot of modern things that a cowboy just out there working on a ranch would never learn. They can all preg check, they can all AI, they can all, it's amazing to me how smart they are. And, there's so many, back when I first went to work there, colleges only offered something called range management, and I don't know, that might have been the only college courses that had to do with ranching, even in our ag colleges. Nowadays, boy, there's ranch management schools everywhere, and a lot of opportunities to learn really good stuff. Of course, the old-timers were all good about teaching us what they could and what they knew. And, of course, we had to shoe our own horses and all that. And of course, nowadays they get a horse shearer to come out and do it, which I like that very much. Horses have changed a lot, I think, in 50 years. A lot of those horses, you could expect them to buck. A lot of the horses didn't get ridden most of the year. The cowboys had their string of 4 to 6 horses that they would ride most year round. But when we would gather in the remuda and add another, 75 horses to the remuda, everybody would get 1 or 2 horses that had been turned out all winter. And those horses would still try to buck you off. So I think horse breeding has got better, and they're a lot gentler horses now than they used to be. And, there were still a lot of horses on that place then that were 15, 18 years old that'll still buck you off. They didn't get gentle with age. Well, and I'm partially because they didn't get ridden that much. But they were good horses. They were good horses, tough, because they got, you put the miles on them. That's another example too. There weren't a lot of ranch pickups even. You often went horseback if you needed to go check wells or anything else. Nowadays, a guy gets in the pickup and goes around the place. There weren't too many ranch pickups.
In an interview with Cowboy magazine in 1991, Gary said this about his early influences. I was painting in the bunkhouse, doing copies of Phippins and copies of Russell's. Russell was my Bible, more or less.
Well, you're very right in that it's very similar to music. It's a creative process. No doubt Charlie Russell was the inspiration. Here I was in this life and fell in love with it and everything about it. The horses, the cattle, the people, the land, all of that, and I was pretty thrilled with it. And then I see Charlie Russell paintings, and man, I said, you know what, I can do that. And I had always been interested in art, even when I was a kid. I was the guy that designed the yearbook covers for school and stuff. And I used to draw on everybody's sweatshirt. I had some ability, I guess, but to see the Charlie Russell stuff was what the light bulb went off. Said, I could do that. And I wanted to because I loved the life so much. And of course, you don't start off being good. I did some things. In fact, I sculpted, actually. I had a cowboy buddy, one of these college guys that was working there for the summer, named Curtis Fort. And he had started sculpting, and he'd give me some wax when we started playing with it. And I'd go over to his house. He had a little kind of workshop thing, and we would do it. And then actually started painting while in the bunkhouse. And just because I wanted to. But Charlie Russell, no doubt, was the inspiration, and Will James, too. And nearly every cowboy, whether they were interested in art or not, they appreciate the art. And every cowboy back then read a lot of Will James, and Charlie Russell's Good Medicine, and long about that time, Dr. Ben Green had books out, and they were pretty much readers, every one of them, and they knew the stories, and they knew the sayings and things like that. Everybody, had a one-liner or something that come out of a Will James book or a Charlie Russell book or something like that. And, that was a great bonding thing when you go to different country. You could mention Will James' Lone Cowboy or something like that, and, you could have a conversation with nearly anybody on a ranch. I'm not sure it's gone, but it'd be a sad thing if it is gone now.
Gary Morton wrote a poem entitled Between Two Worlds about the transition from being a full-time cowboy to being a full-time artist. The first stanza says this: I used to ride for the outfits, and I liked it all too well. But a fire burned inside me. With paint and brush, their story I had to tell. And a stanza later in the poem says this: So if I'd rather be riding, why do I paint, you ask? 'Cause to pay a tribute must be my most important task.
Well, the last few years I was on the bell. Curtis Fort and I had started a thing called Working Cowboy Artists. And Western Horseman was good enough to put a little blurb in the Horseman about it, that we were calling out to working cowboy artists. And we'd kind of come up with some guidelines what we wanted this to be, because at the time, like Western Horseman and a lot of the magazines, there was artwork on the covers, and they didn't know anything about cowboys. And it'd just make us mad, somebody paint a cowboy riding a horse without a curb chain, or had no idea how the cinch worked, and things like that. So we started, we were doing it because we wanted to do it, but we started this thing and thought, well, a bunch of working cowboys ought to know what that stuff is. And Western Horseman ran a little paragraph or two in Western Horseman. And by golly, we got people wanting to join us and all that stuff. And of course, we was doing art for our own enjoyment. We never imagined selling it. And we ultimately had about 10 or 12 members. We had pretty strict guidelines of what you had to be. We wanted to have worked on a ranch for at least 5 years and then portray it authentically and all that stuff. And we had 10 or 12 members, and they were scattered from New Mexico, Texas, plumb to Canada. And still friends with some of those guys, and they're still in the art business. But that's when we kind of got serious about trying to have a show and trying to sell some of it. Well, he and I, the cattle growers at that time, had their fall meeting in Albuquerque at the State Fair. They did it at a hotel called the Four Seasons. And so we rented a room at the Four Seasons, a big one of those meeting rooms, and we put on an art show for the WCA. And I'll be darned, we sold some stuff. In fact, we didn't realize how fortunate we were. Of course, they were all cattle growers. that were there. It was State Fair week, and there were a lot of people in and out of the building. But when we went back and looked at it years later, we couldn't believe how much art we sold there. And so that gave us a little foothold. Of course, then we beat it back to the ranch, went back to work. And as time went on, sold another here, another there, another here. And so by the time I got mad and quit the Bell Ranch, I had been selling some stuff. But it was a huge leap. In fact, it was ignorance is bliss is what it was. I had no idea what I was getting into. When I decided, okay, I'm just going to call myself artist and be an artist. And this is how I'm going to make a living. It was very hard. My family supported me and all that. My work wasn't that great. But I applied the wet saddle blanket theory to that. I got in a few shows around the country. Other artists helped me a lot, gave me tips and pointers. And some of the best advice I got was from a guy named Bob Moline. He's still around, lives in Oklahoma. We were very close friends. And I'd done a painting. It had taken me a long time to do it, a month or two. I took it to Bob, and he'd been in the business. I said, how much is this worth? He said, what do you mean? I said, how do I price that? He said, it's not worth nothing. Man, I cut to the bone. He says, well, he says, no, I take it back. He says, how much did that canvas cost you? And how many dollars of paint is on it? He said, that's what it's worth. Oh, son of a gun. He said, I've been working on this thing for 2 months, and I thought it's pretty good. He says, well, here's the deal. He said, you have to start out selling them for $25. And he says, if you can sell them at $25, you sell enough of them at $25 to know they're worth $25. And he says, then you can go up to 30. And when you sell enough of them at 30, they're worth $30. And that's literally what I did. Then I run into another artist. His name was Austin Duell, and he owned a gallery out in Scottsdale. I said, man, how do you make a living at this game? And he was sort of a commercial artist guy. He could do a painting in an hour. And they weren't great cowboy paintings or anything like that, but he knew the formula to do it. And he said, well, how much do you want to make? And I forget what figure I gave him. He says, how much you sell your paintings for? And I told him, he says, well, all you got to do is do 200 paintings a year. So I did. Literally 1 year, I did close to 200 paintings. Now, they weren't big. They weren't nice. I developed some discipline as to how to stay on track. I would start something and say, okay, in 3 hours, this is finished no matter what. I did that. And I sold them cheap. And gradually over time, the prices went up. And I got better at it. So when I say the wet saddle blanket theory, I literally just did enough of them that I learned how to do it better. And now I'm on the other end of that. It takes me longer to do one than it ever has. The more I learn to paint, the longer it takes me.
Texas cowboy and poet Larry McWhorter once said this about the importance of getting details right when representing the working cowboy. The real cowboys are very proud and jealous of their craft and hate to see it misrepresented in any way. That applies to their poetry as well. I take a lot of pains to make sure that when a cowboy reads my stuff, he won't come away offended. I'd rather explain a line to one who doesn't know than apologize to someone who does know. I think Gary Morton would agree that that sentiment applies to the visual art of the working cowboy as well.
Well, it is very personal. But of course I know and work with these men. In fact, even after I got in the art business, I continued to go to ranches and day work, and be at the Wagon Works and all of that, and got to know these men. But that especially when it comes to their gear and their leather, each one has its own individual desire, and that stuff ain't cheap. Cowboy works a long time to buy a saddle or a pair of boots or anything like that, and they're very proud and very particular about it. They don't want somebody else using their saddle. They don't want somebody borrowing a bridle. They don't want. It's very personal. It's the tools of their trade. And so, it became that way with me. First custom-made saddle I had, it was made just the way I wanted it. And so if I now come along as an artist and paint that guy riding a saddle that's not his, he's offended. So I want to make sure all of that's right. So and I try, and all of my paintings are specific people in specific places and all that. And I was there. I worked from photographs. I try to portray each individual just as they are. It's important to me. And, and it goes beyond that. It goes to the horse he's riding, the country he's in, and all that. Of course, things have kind of got mixed up now that it's so easy to travel. Used to, you wouldn't see a buckaroo in this part of the world, or a flat hat. Now you're allowed to see one. If that is the case, I'm not going to change that guy up and put him in Nevada. If he's a flat hat working in Texas, I'll make sure that's what the picture is. But I just think it's such a prideful thing with the men and women that work on ranches that I owe it to them to get it right. What I do is go to different ranches, either as a cowboy and work, or sometimes they're very kind and let me come as an artist, and I could carry my camera. Spent a couple of years on the Bell, and I had a little pocket camera, and I had it all the time. And I just take pictures of everything. Sometimes it's lighting, no real rhyme or reason. I just see something I like and take a picture of it. Well, then I come home and look at all those pictures and look at thousands of pictures. Some of them jump right out at you and you think, man, that's nice. Others, you'll have to do a composite of many photos to make what you want. I hate to admit it, sometimes there's a guy in the corner wearing a ball cap or something, and I just won't do it. Or I'll, put a hat on him or leave him out altogether. So to me, there's not a lot of rhyme or reason. It can be just an interesting photograph that I think I can do this and I can do that and I can do this. And then ultimately try to tell a story. That painting behind me, probably take a cowboy to understand it, but the title of it is Hurrying the Unwilling. Well, anybody that's ever worked around a bunch of bulls, they pretty much ignore you, especially when you're in a hurry. Now, they can be quick and they can hurt you, but when they want to, not when you want to move them fast. And so that's kind of what that painting depicts. Sometimes I get ideas that are inspired by all these photographs that, an idea like, okay, you can't take a photograph at night like that. That's called 5 a.m. And the guy's saddling up to go bring in the horses before breakfast. It has the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper in it and the North Star. And I had to do the research that is 5 a.m. on May 19th to be in New Mexico. That dipper changes all year depending on where you're at and what time of year it is. So, sometimes you dream things like that up and do the research and make it right. the process, I look at these photographs and I say, okay, that's good. I've got my computer. I pull it up on the computer and I start drawing and putting it all together and just paint it. They say a painting, and they probably say this about songwriting as well. A painting is really nothing more than a correction of mistakes. But the sad news is you almost have to make the mistake before you know what to correct. And it's true that when you start a painting, as long as there's any white still on the canvas, you can't. It's very hard to make a judgment about color or value compared to that white, because very few things are pure white like a canvas would be. So you got to get it all covered up, and then you just start layer upon layer, pushing and pulling, correcting color and all that stuff, and it's really just correcting mistakes. Now, the one place that you don't want mistakes is in the drawing part, because you want everything in proportion and anatomically correct and all those things. But once again, it starts with the foundation, A horse just starts with an oval, which is his body shape. Then you put a head in there, and it starts out pretty loose, and you refine it and refine it and refine it until it gets right. Robert Lockheed lived in Santa Fe and did a good number of Bell Ranch paintings. He's dead. He came to the Bell Wagon one time. He did a magnificent painting that I believe is hanging in the Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City called the Bell Remuda. And it's the Remuda crossing the creek. And at that time we had one old white horse, and he was always out in the lead. And it's true, just as true as can be. But Robert Lockheed was a tremendous artist, and he could literally do a painting of a horse walking across the trail, and by the time he got to the other end of the trail, it was finished. In fact, I told him, I said, I'd like to be an artist. And we're sitting at the wagon. He says, well, he said, let me give you a few pointers. And he drew, of course, our horses were standing there hobbled. We were eating lunch. And he drew a couple of horses, 5 minutes. Showed me how to do that. Made it look easy. So I've had a lot of good help from other artists.
Gary Morton has been an important part of the cowboy renaissance of the last 40 years, not only through his artwork, but also through his involvement with cowboy poetry and his appearances in cowboy photography books like Bank Langmore's book, The Cowboy.
Yeah, and it's interesting. At the Bell, there was a few guys that could play the guitar. In fact, O.R.W. Hampton showed up at my camp when he was about 17 years old, and he was, playing some of the old music and writing some of his own and all that. The poetry thing, for me, I really hadn't heard much poetry. In fact, it was after I'd gotten the art business and I had been cowboying down to 06 at Alpine. I went down there for wagon work spring and fall for, 5 or 6 years. And of course, I fell in love with that country and all those people. Joel Nelson at that time was the boss. He was working for Chris Lacey. And it blew my mind when they started that Texas poetry gathering. Well, he and Barney kind of started it, and I'm sure they had a committee, but they're the ones I knew. And Barney called me up one day, says, why don't you write a poem, come down here? I said, what? So I did. And it was about myself, about my life, and it was called Between Two Worlds. So I had that one to recite, and by this time, I had already been to Elko. Waddy had invited me to Elko to show artwork. And I think they started that Texas gathering second or third year of Elko. Must have been about the third year of Elko. And Barney was a great instigator of things. She says, well, you need to memorize some other poems and not just do that one. So I did. And I'd been to Elko, and I, of course, heard all the greats at Elko. So then I, stumbled upon Bruce Kiskadden. Of course, stumbled. He was highly quoted, and his poems were said a lot in Elko in the early years. Of course, got to know Ross Knox and Waddy and all those people, and started buying the books. And so I started learning a few poems. But I didn't really, in 1976 or 7, Bank Langmore had done a photography book on the Cowboy, and there was a lot of pictures of me in it. And we got to be friends. In fact, I gave him, you may have seen one of them, Jim Brooks, a black cowboy from Montana at the time. Those little tiny classified ads in the back of Western Horseman. He was advertising this book that he had written, and it was something like Big Outfit Cowboy. And I think he actually did a couple different versions of it. But he'd go through there, and he had chapters, and if you were, just wanting to go to work on a big ranch, he broke it down into several little chapters and told you what you could expect on those big ranches and what was expected of you. And in the back, which is why everybody bought the book, it had a list of all the big ranches in the West, who the manager was, and a phone number. I bet those managers just hated him for doing that. But I gave Bank Langmore one of these books when he started out. He started in Texas, and he ended up in New Mexico. Of course, he was just making his trip. And he got on that thing, and he went to most of those big ranches, and they end up in this photography book. When the book's finished, I'd been at the Bell about 6 years at the time, and I hadn't had a vacation or nothing. And so he asked me if I wanted to go with him, and he went around to all those ranches, delivered books and photographs, and said thank you. In fact, I flew out of Amarillo, flew to Billings, Montana, and Benny Binion's plane picked me up in Billings and flew me to Jordan, Montana, where Benny's ranch was. And I got in the car with Bank then, and we made that whole big trip and ended up in Las Vegas, Nevada at Binion's. And I flew home back to Amarillo from Las Vegas, Nevada. I had been exposed to the cowboy poetry in those bars in Nevada. The bars that were in this book, we went, what was the name of that place? It was out north of Elko, little old bitty town, Paradise Valley. There was a bar in Paradise Valley, Nevada. And there's a great picture in that book of Ross Knox and I think Waddy and a bunch of guys in that bar. And the drunker they got, the more they could recite poetry. It was interesting. I get dumber the more I drink. But these guys, they might not say 3 words when they walk in, but they start drinking, and man, they can just go on and on. And Ross, man, that guy, how many poems does he know? 300, and they're long, all of them. I had been exposed a little bit, so anyway, Barney Nelson's the one to blame on that. And Joel, it's funny, I worked for Joel 5 or 6 years on that place. He never said 3 words to anybody. He wasn't mad at anybody or anything. He was quiet. He'd tell you what you need to do. That is it. That first poetry gathering I went to, I heard him talk more at that poetry gathering than I heard him talking 6 years on the ranch. It was funny. And now, of course, he's one of the greats.
In 2010, Gary Morton leased land and ran cattle on the Mescalero Apache Indian Reservation in southern New Mexico. In a letter written to Range magazine in the spring of 2010, Gary wrote this: "As I write this, I am camped at a remote place called Lower Elk on the Mescalero Apache Reservation. It is a peaceful, quiet, and sometimes lonesome place. I am surrounded by some of God's finest creation, but it is also a rough, tough place on horses and cowboys."
What an experience, yeah. Well, I was actually running a ranch south of Las Vegas and wanted to make a move. And so the first deal I did was on the Valles Caldera, which is west of Los Alamos. If you haven't been over there in your New Mexico travels, you should go look. When the Spaniards first saw it, they says, "This is the most excellent grazing land on earth." It's a caved-in volcano. So it's a circle of mountains with a mountain sticking up out of the middle, and the biggest mountain valley I ever saw. In fact, they call it the Valle Grande, and it's a township. It's 36 sections of mountain valley. The lowest elevation on it's 8,000 feet. The highest is 12,000. So I leased that deal, and of course I didn't have money to stock it, so I found a guy that had cattle and became the middleman and caretaker. Made a deal with him, and we had a couple of thousand head up there, and it's owned by the federal government at the time, and still is. In fact, now they've changed it into a national park, so that'll never happen there again. So I had big plans of getting that lease multiple years, and we really did a good job. But come to find out, there were people in power over there that hated cows and didn't want to see a cow on the place. It ended up being very political. That ranch is one of the Baca locations, and this probably doesn't pertain to the question you asked, but it's a very interesting New Mexico piece of history. We are sitting on what was the Baca land grant right here, and it went plumb to Mora, to the tops of the mountains, all the way south of Las Vegas. It was a Spanish grant. When the Mexicans got control of New Mexico, they created around some of these towns community grants, and they gave these towns a piece of land that was wholly owned by the community, so they could run their goats, their sheep, their horses, their cattle, whatever. Well, the Mexican government took from old Baca this grant and gave it to the Las Vegas. It was the Las Vegas community grant. Well, and then of course New Mexico was not under Mexican control that long. It was, I don't know, maybe 4 years. And then the U.S. took it over as a territory. Well, all these Spanish land grants that had been given, Spanish and Mexican land grants, there was a big rush to Washington to get their grants recognized by the U.S. government. Well, old Baca went to get try to correct the wrong that had been done to him. And he went to the U.S. government and said, "Look, I had all this, and it was 500,000 acres is what it was. And I had this, and the Mexicans took it from me. And I haven't got plumb back into the research, but it might be the only land grant given by the U.S. government. And what they told him is go anywhere in the territory and pick you 5 100,000 acre pieces." He did. Location number 2 is was part of the old bell. It's a funny little corner that sticks out of the Pablo Montoya grant. This Valles Caldera was location number 1, and it was 100,000 acres. The ORO Ranch in Arizona was one of the Baca locations. There was one called, I think it's called the Empire in southern Arizona. That was the fourth one. And then there's one that Trinchera Ranch in Colorado is the fifth one. So anyway, I got into doing this, leasing country and then finding somebody that had cattle that wanted us to care for them. And so the powers that be weren't going to let me have that lease. 2,000 head is the most they ever run on that place west of Los Alamos. And the federal government owned it 15 years before they turned it into a national park. And it just turned out the way they just didn't want any cattle on it. When it was in private hands, they ran anywhere from 6,000 to 9,000 head of yearlings on that place every summer. And I had 2,000 there, and they were writing op-eds in the Albuquerque Journal that we were going to destroy the place. It just wasn't true. So I had to find another place to lease, and that's how I ended up on the reservation. I made a deal with the Indians, and we had 5,000 head down there. Of course, no housing. We lived in a tent. And we had those cattle down there for 8 months. Moved in there the 1st of March, snowing, and I finally left there right before Thanksgiving in a snowstorm. It's a hard place to run cattle. You look at it, and I looked at it, it's paradise. There's a world of grass down there, but there's not much water. They had watered it with pipelines and little tubs and whatnot, and it was pretty hard to keep the pipelines flowing and the tubs full. And it was designed for cows, not yearlings. A bunch of yearlings are like teenagers or something. They travel in gangs. When 100 head of thirsty steers hit a tub that's as big as that table, it just don't work. They're going to tear something up. So it wasn't a profitable deal, but it was a great experience. The Indians got along with most of them. There was certainly a portion of them that hated us, thought the white man was getting rich off the Indian land. But by and large, we got along with them really great. There were actually 5 of us there, including myself. I had them set up in camps. There was one guy who lived in a little tribal trailer, and we had 2 ends of the reservation. We didn't have the whole thing leased. The whole thing was 480,000 acres. We did not have the whole thing leased. We had the southeast corner and the northwest corner, which is all of that's on the backside or west side of Sierra Blanca. And then the southeast corner is down there closer to Mayhill and Cloudcroft and down in that corner. And it was all great country. So we had those cattle scattered out. We think we did it pretty well, but we had a pretty high death loss, and then we were come up short a whole bunch of cattle. Just like on the Valles Caldera, the year before, it was 100,000 acres and 2,000 head. We were one that we couldn't account for. I think we actually had about 10 die, but we knew it and knew what the problem was, and only one that died somewhere or got away or something. We couldn't explain what happened. On the reservation, it was quite different than that. We had a high death loss, plus we come up short over 100 head, and that was costly. But it was fun. They got wild horses. I don't think they're the true Mustangs, and they're probably not wild, but they're horses that the Indians owned and just turned loose. And I had to think of, Henry Herbert Nibs, where the ponies come to drink. Be laying in a teepee every night. And, of course, we camped near water. There was a good well there where we camped. But wild horses had been coming in there to drink forever. And so our camp didn't bother them, but they would wait till midnight or something, and then you could hear them coming in off the ridge. And they would go in there at night and drink, and it was like it's like clockwork. You could hear those horses coming, and then they'd leave. Of course, a lot of elk on that place. I never, of course, we thought about it. I didn't think it would probably happen, but we were gathering cattle there in the fall. And I was up on a high ridge, coming off this ridge, gathering cattle. And that ridge kind of had a swell in it, and then it dropped down in a little hole and then another. And I come over that, I was trotting pretty fast. I come over that swell and started falling off into this little low spot. And I didn't even see them. There was a bunch of horses there. And in fact, I got them up out of bed. It was early in the morning. And man, they jumped up, a bunch of those wild horses, and there was no stud with them. And that son of a gun come to me. And you talk about a sick feeling when you know that your horse ain't going to outrun that loose horse. And that son of a gun's coming at you with his old mouth open and slinging his head and all that. I had a pistol with me, and I shot it in the ground 2 or 3 times, but he got from here to that door from me before he turned around. It was pretty scary. And, what are you going to do? There's no point in running. And if he wants to jump up and get in the saddle with you, he will. We had other things on the res. We were looking at a different part that they wanted us to lease the next year. And it was the west side of the reservation, and it's all that on the west side of the Sacramento Mountains there. Oh, it's pretty and it's lush and wild. Man, it's wild country. And we hauled horses over there one day and started riding around looking at it and seeing what we could figure out. I mean, as soon as we unloaded horses, we looked in the mud, and there's a bare human footprint, barefooted. And what the heck? I mean, that country is not someplace you want to go barefooted. We followed it down this little old 2-rut road. We followed those tracks for a long ways and finally lost them. Anyway, we told some of our Indian friends when we got home that night about seeing those barefoot human footprints over there. And it's just kind of an Indian thing, but they told the story, and by the next morning that the tribe believed we had seen Bigfoot over there. It was funny. Never did know what that was about. There's all kinds of interesting stuff on the reservation. There's a place there, they call them the moving rocks. Can't explain it, but it's a pile of boulders that's obviously human placed, just kind of in a pyramid, and they're big old bullcod rocks that big. And they told us about it, and it's very remote. I mean, there's no reason to go there. We just happened to go by there horseback gathering cattle one day, and way on the backside, no road to it, no nothing else. And the Indians said that those rocks move. Sure enough, I went by it about 3 times, and that pile of rocks was not in the same place. I mean, nobody ever even sees it. I mean, I bet we're the only white man that ever saw it. But it's pretty interesting.
Well, this has been great, Gary.
Good.
I really appreciate you taking the time to tell me your stories and letting me come and invade your home here.
Well, no, thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed it.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Gary Morton for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Gary at GaryMortonArt.com. I'd like to thank Flint Custom Hats for sponsoring today's episode. You can find out more about Flint hats and order your own custom hat at FlintHat.com. You can find out more about me and this show at AndyHedges.com. If you're enjoying this show and would like to help me keep it going, you can make a donation on the website, or you could become a patron by going to patreon.com/AndyHedges. patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. You could also take the time to write a review and leave a rating on the iTunes store, or you could simply tell a friend to listen to the show. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.